So hello everyone. My name's Tomas Millar, and I run a practice called Miller Howard Workshop. We're based in Stroud. And today I'm going to talk about communicating our added value. I'm going to do that, one, by explaining a little bit about how we charge our fees, and also then looking specifically how virtual reality has changed the way we work. I thought I'd start just by showing some of the buildings we do. So there's 10 of us in the practice, and we work sort of about 50-50 on residential and kind of small-scale commercial projects. We pride ourselves on being kind of digital craftsmen and or kind of rural innovators is another kind of thing we've been kind of thinking about, and that's really kind of bringing kind of things from a tech industry kind of into architecture, but actually creating buildings that don't necessarily feel like they've been kind of had a lot of tech behind them. I'm quite interested in kind of today, the size of practice that people are from. So perhaps if you're kind of under 10 of you in the practice, you could put your hand up. Between 10 and 25? Over 25? Yeah, so there's a pretty kind of even mix here today, which is interesting. Yeah. So what I'm about to explain is probably kind of more geared towards the kind of the smaller or medium-sized practices, but I think it'd be interesting to think about how that works for larger practices as well. So the first thing I start with, about 4 years ago, I got deeply into business self-help, and these are 4 books that I could highly recommend for anyone. They're really great. Particularly the one on the left, actually, is from one of the guys who founded Pixar. And it's really interesting seeing another discipline that tries to wrestle with kind of creative and technical issues kind of in equal amount. So I'm going to start off thinking about customer value. So I think this is something that I always struggled to kind of really get what it means. And I think it's partly you see these kind of definitions of it, which are a bit difficult to kind of grapple with and get your head around. I quite like the equation at the bottom of this rather than the kind of rather than a sentence. And I think in architecture we quite often end up talking about the cost side of this. So if customer value equals the benefits minus the costs, we end up focusing quite a lot on the costs. And it used to be that those costs were kind of fixed. And so the benefits would be the thing that everyone would have to differentiate you on. But now that you can anyone can charge whatever they like, it's a balance of these. But I think what I'm going to try and focus on is how can we focus on the benefits rather than just the costs. So just a quick thought experiment. If you going on a holiday, there are going to be certain benefits to going on this holiday, and there's going to be a cost to that. And for different people, that equation of the benefits minus the costs is going to have different customer value, basically. So if you're very wealthy, you like the sun, you like to go swimming, you haven't got much time, but you've got a week to go on holiday, a few £1,000s is probably fine. Whereas if you, maybe you're poorer, you don't like it getting too hot, you can't swim, then actually the value of this holiday probably isn't as high. So what I want to think about is 3 different architects who are coming to sort of bid for a project. And at the moment, I think sort of what a lot of people do is, rightly so, is kind of use the RIBA plan of work to kind of map out how we're going to work, and the different stages we're going to work to. We all then have a kind of a website. And this is imagining a smaller scale practice, design-led practice. We all have a website. That website maybe has the kind of menus at the top that all look pretty similar. They might have all won an award at some point or another. And they might all have a bit of text that talks about design-led, no style, each designer unique response, that kind of thing. So this is what the clients are being presented with. And so when we then present our fees, given that everything else is pretty similar, really you can only distinguish on the costs. And so you're likely to go for that lower one. There is an argument that you might go for the middle one because you're worried the lower one's too low. But so I started to think about kind of other industries, and so this is the AA, how they charge for their fees. They do this thing called segmenting their market. So they're segmenting their market sort of into people who want different benefits. So you've got those benefits down the side and a different cost. And they're even suggesting the one that they kind of favour. That's quite a simple version with a few benefits. Here are kind of examples of ones with kind of much more benefits, with mapping that out. And actually car manuals might have kind of 100 pages of the different configurations of the different cars. So now let's see these same three architects presenting their work. First one gives a fee of 25,000, next 35. And then this one actually presents three different options with the benefits down on the left, and then the different costs of that up at the top. Now, suddenly, looking at that as a client, you're like, well, actually, I need to look into what this architect's actually providing. And then you start to ask yourself, are the other architects providing those same benefits? And you can also see how the lowest cost is lower than the previous lowest one, and the highest is higher than the other one. So what we're trying to do is we're now trying to kind of push the client to look more at the benefits rather than just focusing on the costs. And so I think this is really what I'm trying to kind of promote, I suppose, is really for us all to think about the individual benefits that we can provide for a client. So this is an example of our fee proposal. And we're trying to make it as long as possible and detailed as possible. And actually, at the moment, what that's causing is a lot of architects to come back saying, I'm really, this is quite complicated. But I think that's actually quite a good thing, because what we're providing is a complicated service. And actually, for people to start asking questions about what all those are, what is an MBS specification? Kind of what is the virtual reality thing that you provide? It is a good thing for us to start explaining, so you can actually start to explain things very early on. The other thing is, since we've done this and we kind of map out numbers of meetings, we've had hardly any disputes with clients over fees, because it's so clearly mapped out about what we're going to provide and when. And so you can say this is a kind of summary of how those fees are charged. And so if someone says a kind of what percentage fees do you charge, well, it's kind of anything between 7 and 20%, depending on what you want. So I've presented this previously, and people have sometimes said, well, that's all fine for you to do that, but what if we all started charging in the same way? Isn't it just a gimmick that once we all do it, it's not going to work? Well, let's see what happens when that happens. So here you've got these three architects again, and now they're all charging in this kind of segmented way. And if I said kind of which is the best value, there's no clear winner. It kind of depends on what you want. And so different people are going to go for different versions of those fees, but the really important thing is they're probably going to choose it because of the benefits rather than just the costs. And as long as you're making sure that the benefits you're providing really suit you and your practice, then you're going to be connecting with the clients who really suit you. And so I think even if we all ended up doing this as a way of charging our fees, I think the profession as a whole would benefit. Obviously, it's interesting. I think it particularly works for a kind of domestic client. It's interesting how that might work for larger projects. But I'm sure there's a kind of an equivalent method. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the VR. I've actually got a kind of... I could have a go at an interactive session here. So I know you've all been told to turn off your phones. Well, actually, I'll start by talking about this. So here's a client. It's an anonymous client that we had. And they always had questions about the value of what they were being provided with. And they were kind of tending to go for lower quality, generally going for price over quality, and choosing the lower quality things and choosing to reduce our fee where possible. And I kind of thought it was because they were running out of money. And then a week after the building was finished, they went out and bought one of these. And it just really struck me that Tesla had convinced them of the design of the value of their product, whereas we'd obviously had kind of more work to do. And it made me think about the way we kind of what we're providing when we kind of provide our services. And in a lot of ways you could think, well, what we're doing is we're providing a building. And let's kind of talk about all the benefits of that building. But But actually, if you've got the client, the architect here, what we're really providing is a set of information for the clients to then have a building. So you'll get all of this, it's a whole load of drawings. And if they're lucky, the client might get a kind of a rendering. What we realise is there's this massive gap of understanding between the architect and the client. And I think it's only recently we're kind of really coming to terms with how big that gap actually is. And that's, partly through using virtual reality. So you could reduce that gap by doing some nice renders, which might explain the building. But that's only ever going to be as good as kind of an estate agent's brochure is for kind of understanding a building. If you're going to buy a house, you don't buy a house, a ready-built house, just off looking at it in the estate agent's window. You go and you walk around the house to really understand it, because you can't quite get the feel of it from just looking at photos. And that's kind of where we've kind of come on to kind of looking at virtual reality. So I'm going to try this interactive session, if you can bear with me. So if you get out your phones and you could go to menti.com, so you can see at the top there, www.menti.com, and then use when you type that in, you'll get a code. If you enter this code at the top, it should then ask you this question. So which VR experiences have you tried before? So I'm quite intrigued about this. So some early adopters there. So that's interesting. So the Oculus Rift seems to be kind of quite high. So this is really interesting. So I did a talk about 6 months ago, and I'd say it was 80% in the never tried, which is so it's clearly being sort of more used. Fantastic. So I'll then move this on, if I can. So which headsets do you or your practice own? Next question. So we've clearly got some gamers there, maybe, with that PlayStation 4 one. So that's really interesting. So actually kind of like, quite a mix there. I mean, I think personally, I think that VR was kind of made for architecture, and it's just, basically we're really benefiting from the games industry has kind of given us all this R&D on this tool that we can then use with our clients. The Google Cardboard is a great thing, and there's really easy ways. There's a program called Sketchfab, which you can very quickly, very cheaply start using the cardboard with, and it's all free. We've got the HTC Vive in the office. The HTC Vive just has brought out a Vive Pro, which is just incredible. And people you have these handheld controllers in the world, and people actually end up putting them down on the table in the virtual space, thinking that they're putting them down on the table when they're finished, and the kind of controller drops to the floor. It's that level of realism. So I'll try this. So what are your thoughts on using virtual reality in architecture? Advantages, disadvantages. So you should be able to type, and that's going to come up on the screen. Anticipation. So generally really positive stuff there. There's kind of few concerns around the cost. The other thing that seems really key here is a kind of communication tool. Yeah, clients feel that you're cutting edge. So the lack of materiality is an interesting one. So I think there are some disadvantages as well. One of the things that we found since we started using it is we don't model as much anymore, which I think is a bit of a shame. The only thing about the materiality is it's easier to understand a space that in a simple model that isn't rendered than just providing a normal render. The sickness is an interesting one. So sickness, we were finding that early on, but really, say the Vive with a high-end graphics card, you really shouldn't get any nausea at all. So if you are experiencing kind of sickness in it, it might just be a case of the kind of the technology that you're using. Great, so that feels like some really interesting kind of feedback. Okay, I'll carry on. It's interesting to kind of gather a whole lot of views at the same time on that. It's really, I might see if I can make that available to everyone after the session. So coming back to this, I mean, I think what we're finding is in the really high-end version, you've got these experiences where you actually feel like you become that world. And so there's kind of games that are really taking advantage of it. Also experiences, Google Earth in the Vive is just an amazing experience, being able to navigate all of Google Earth within it. And then there's also these tools for designing in VR. So we're actually currently looking at, we're currently working to make WikiHouse buildable in VR. Excuse me, and we're working with a developer with that. So what we really think that VR does is it kind of shrinks that gap between the architect and the client. And I think it's one of the first forms of representation that actually reacts to your body. So different people will experience it in different ways depending on your height. So if you're shorter, you'll experience the building as if you're short. If you're taller, you'll experience it if you're tall, which I think that's the kind of first example of that. You can get these extremely high-end, so this is from Unreal Engine 4, very high-end outputs. I won't play these through. This is the final slide. So this is kind of... I think what I'm hoping VR does is create a more human-centric architecture by kind of seeing how our bodies kind of actually kind of fit within the spaces and kind of going back to the kind of Vitruvian man and kind of really looking at it being focused on the human body. So, so the takeaways, try and compete on services and benefits you provide and not on price. Differentiate your practice from your competitors. So if we all differentiate ourselves, we can all be good at what we're individually good at and get paid appropriately for that. And then segment your market with different service levels. Thank you.